Hey everyone, I just finished 100 books in 2023 and I thought what a better time to look at my reading stats for 2023 and reflect a little bit on the reading of basically how my reading went in 2023, because things are a little bit different this year than to previous years, and it had me thinking. Also, I'm thinking about 2024 goals and where I want to go, but I haven't quite finished that, so there will not be much talk about that. And to start off this video, let's talk a little bit about numbers and stats. I'm using mostly a spreadsheet where I track the books that I read with the things that interest me, and then also I look at the graphs or some information from the Storygraph stats, but more on that later. First, on the numbers. So like I said, I read 100 books. 43 of those were audiobooks, 36 ebooks, and 21 physical books. So it's roughly, again, a 50-50 split with more reading than listening, which I kind of like, and also reflects that I wasn't out exercising, running, and walking much. So I'm not sure what I think about that. But when I look at the total pages that I've read 14,215 pages this year, which averages around 237 pages per book. And I listened to 27,812 minutes, which averages about 592 minutes per book. Now, while the lengths or the average length of each book doesn't differ from last year, the average length of the audiobook has quite increased. Last year, my average book length for audiobooks was 432 minutes. So that also might reflect why I listened to less books, about 10 than last year, but I've listened to longer things, which is kind of true. I listened to quite a few big books this year, which often helps me get to the classics that I want to read, and also sometimes really, really big books are nice. I also listened to 2 collections this year of P.G. Wodehouse and Jules Verne, so that also was a long audiobook. Kind of screwing up the numbers maybe, but who cares? So that were interesting. I really listened to longer things. I think I also read a little bit longer things, and I think that's the only number that might change to the end of the year, because I really would like to finish the series Heaven Official's Blessing, and those books are around 400 pages. So there's 5 of them left. That might screw up the numbers a little bit. Let's talk about authors for a minute here, because I'm not really tracking authors specifically or much about authors. What I'm tracking is if I'm reading unique authors, meaning a new author for the year, not a new author for me, but basically in the year, have I read a book by that author before? But I don't track every number or not the author twice. So I read multiple books by Terry Pratchett this year, but I only counted Terry Pratchett once. The same for Aliette de Bodard or other authors I read a series from. That's usually when that happens, when I read series, that I read the same author more often. I would like to read the same author more often because I'm getting to the backlog, but as usual, that is not happening as much as I would like to. So I read about 80 different authors this year, which is nice. And if I break down between men and women, it's a little more skewed towards female authors this year. Normally I can manage an even breakdown, but I don't know. This year there have been a lot of women in my books, and I don't mind that. Another thing I tried tracking about authors is the country where they're from, because I wanted to see if I'm reading different countries. And I'm not sure if I want to keep that up, because most of my reading was still from the US, but that doesn't mean that the books I read from the US were not diverse authors. So I'm thinking of tracking authors even less again, because I really don't want to track more and pry into authors, whether they're originated, what they think, all the personality stuff that I personally am not that interested in about the authors, especially for tracking reasons. So I might just continue tracking the unique authors in this roughly average way of male, female. And if I know if it's something else, then I might track, but it's not something I'm looking for to track, if that makes sense. Anyways, moving on. Let's look at the things I'm also tracking. I always have a look at how many German authors or books written originally in German I read. And this year there were only 5. I would like to have it a little bit higher, that number, but I've also been very unsuccessful in enjoying the books that I read by German authors. So I gave up on that a little bit this year, but yeah, not sure if I can increase that. Last year was only 4 books, so I did improve a little bit, but yeah, not sure how that's going, but I keep tracking that. I'm also tracking how many nonfiction books I read, and this year so far there were 17 books, and I'm tracking the classics or modern classics. I count them in one category, that were 15 this year. With the nonfiction and classics books, I'm quite happy. I think if I can hit about 10% on the nonfiction and classics books over the year, I'm quite good with what I'm reading. And with 100 books, we're at 17% and 15%. So that's okay. Another thing I'm tracking is translations. And this year I thought I read more translations, but apparently I only read 16 so far. That will go up in December because the series I'm reading is translated from Chinese. Overall, what this number always shows me is that I think I'm reading more translated books than I actually am. But then again, 16% is not that bad. Last year I read 19 books in translations, but I also read 119 books in total. So that's probably about the same amount. Anyways, another thing I'm tracking is rereads. I like to reread, and I would like to know how often or how many books I reread. And this year that was 15, so also a nice round number. So I'm guessing if I want to look about or think about goals for next year, 15% of my reading and all the nonfiction, classics, translation, and rereads would be a nice goal. Another thing I'm tracking, where I don't have specific goals for when it fits the category, is LGBTQIA books. So there I add books that were written by an author that I know is LGBTQIA, but mostly I'm adding books that either have a focus on characters or plot in that area. And those were 28 books this year. Now, I might have to say that that reflects a lot about my reading this year, where I'm going to go into detail a little bit further down when I talk about genres and the kind of books I read. So looking at these numbers, I think I'm quite happy with that. It is a spread of books that I would like to have around the year and reflecting my reading what it is. So a mixture of fiction and non-fiction, a mixture of translations and original books. If we count the English originals and German originals, then I'm even reading more original books than without, but anyways. And so I think that's a good spread how I like my reading to be all over the year. Now, there were also 7 DNFs this year. I tracked DNFs for the first time this year, and I'm not a big DNFer. But what I found interesting, not counting the last 2 books that I DNF'd because I just couldn't understand them and they were really not doing well with my mental health. That was nothing about the books, but that was all about me. The other 5 books I DNF'd throughout the year were all very hyped books. The Daughter of the Moon Goddess, Der Pfau, I think it's a phoenix in English, and Braiding Sweetgrass, She Who Became the Sun, and The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. Those are all popular books that were hyped in different parts. Der Pfau was a very popular book that friends of mine tried to get me to read over and over again for years, ever since it came out, and I was bored, and so I decided to stop reading it. Daughter of the Moon Goddess sounds like it would be something I would be interested in, but the writing was just too telling. There was too much telling. And then there was a love triangle. I really don't like love triangles. And overall, I just spoiled myself and looked at what happened and decided I don't want to finish it, because overall, it could have been something I really enjoy, but it wasn't. The same goes for The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi. I was bored. It started off really nice, but then the narration got a little bit more like they were talking down to me, and the story, I don't know, I just didn't get into it. And this She Who Became the Sun, I just lost interest at some point completely. And Braiding Sweetgrass, yeah. So that was a very popular nonfiction. Everybody said it changed their mind or blew their mind and gave them new ideas, motivations, or whatever, life-changing and things. And I was just bored. I couldn't focus. I really didn't care about anything that had happened. And that's something I noticed about my DNFing. It's when I lose interest, when nothing in the book really keeps me going, either the writing, the story, or plot, or whatever. It might even just be a character. I really am a finisher. But when I get bored and don't care about a book anymore, I am really going to put it down. And a lot of these books were picked up because they were popular. So the usual things, high expectations that cannot be met. There are two stats the Storygraph offers that I would like to look at. One is the moods stat. I really enjoy that pie chart where it tells you what kind of moods the books are in that you read or what kind of moods they meet. And for me, it's the first is adventurous, the second reflective, the third emotional, and that has stayed the same last year and this year. The fourth was a little bit, they changed fourth and fifth, mysterious and funny, but those first three are really a huge amount of what I'm looking for. And I can understand that. When I want something, I'm often looking for adventurous things. I like to connect on an emotional level to the characters and to the story. The reflective part, I think, is a lot to do with the nonfiction that I'm reading, because I'm reading a lot of things in the self-help category, if you want to call it. And also I like to read books where the characters and people reflect on what they're doing, so that you may see character development or things in the story. And I really like that. The other stat that I'm taking was not too seriously, but I always find super interesting, is the genre breakdown. Now, this had me thinking about my reading. This is where it all started, why I wanted to talk about my reading and reflected on my reading, how it changed in 2023. Because this, I think, shows how differently my reading was this year the most. In 2023, the first categories or the most read genres for me are fantasy, LGBTQIA+, romance, science fiction, and then literary. And I find that very interesting, because let's look at 2022, where my most read genre was also fantasy, but then the second was literary, and LGBTQIA was third, and then science fiction. There was no talk of romance. Romance was very far down in the genre breakdown last year. And looking at the difference of numbers of books that I read in those different genres that are categorized, there was also a huge increase in the fantasy. Now, I think this reflects how 2023 was for me in general. 2022 was a busy year at work already, and it was stressful, and I came into 2023 exhausted already. And for the first half of the year, the amount of work and stress just stayed up. So a lot of the things I just couldn't really grasp. So I was looking a lot for escapism, where I didn't have to really think about different themes or difficult themes, many motives, really had to dig deep to understand the books. I was looking for entertainment. And fantasy and science fiction are great entertainment. And I don't know why I read so many books classified as romance this year. I kind of fell into that due to recommendations and some series that were completely classified as romance, which I would just mostly say they were fantasy, they were LGBTQIA, yes, and they did have a touch of romance, but in varying levels. So there were books that were categorized as romance that I would say very low on the romance, and then there were others where I definitely would say high on the romance. And usually I'm not a big romance reader, and I noticed in recent weeks that as I could concentrate and focus less and less and less, romance worked rather well. The stories didn't really have complicated plot points. It was mostly, do they get together and how do they get together? And I don't know, I'm definitely not planning on continuing down on that road. I would really enjoy to increase the literary books anymore, because personally I would always say that I'm mostly a literary reader, but the amount of fantasy books I read is always high. I don't know why I don't categorize my reading as mostly fantasy, because in my brain I read mostly literary books. Tricking myself and wanting to be a literary reading snob, probably. Anyways, so this is what I think is very interesting about looking at what you read and how much you read. I notice that I always want to read longer books, but when I'm stressed and I can't focus, I tend to read shorter, simple books in less complicated structures. I just want to finish things. And I also like to just dive into plot driven books where it's not character focused, where there's nothing driving you forward, or complicated, beautiful language that reflects on the characters. But overall, I think this is something that shows not only how my reading was, but also how my year was, how exhausted I've been. And even though I have worked less since June, I am still recovering from being so overworked for over a year. And it is interesting how that not only affects the amount of things I do outside of work, but also the amount of things I can actually grasp. I really noticed that. And the reading stats, when I looked at the genre breakdown, really hit home for me, because I was surprised that I think it's 38 books that were categorized as fantasy. That's more than a third of my reading this year. That's a lot. I read nice books, nothing wrong with that, but it also showed that I really, really needed a lot of escapism this year. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this. It's just interesting to look at what you've read and think about what you've read and why you've read. And I'm not sure if I really want to take all of that information and change it for 2024. Like I said, I don't really have narrowed down what I want to do with my 2024 reading, but I do want to pay more attention again to what I'm reading and not just go blindly ordering the next book just because it's available, or picking up willy-nilly whatever. On the other side, it's a lot of fun to do that. Anyways, let me know in comments how your 2023 reading was. Did you see a change to different years? Did you notice that you discovered maybe a new genre that you enjoyed, a new type of author, a new type of storytelling? Maybe you also had to move away from what you normally did. I heard a lot of people being slumped this year and going from one slump to the next and finding ways out of it. And for me, I always think switching up genres and what you actually read is a good way to get yourself out of a slump, or really not get into a slump, because it keeps the reading different and diverse. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this little look at what I've been reading, the things that affected it, and the numbers, the outcome. We all love stats, don't we? Thank you all for watching.